To another episode of E-Talks. Today, we're joined by Dr. Steve Kilianski, who is a social psychologist specialized in belief systems and the human need for certainty. He earned his PhD in social psychology from Rutgers in 2001 and spent over 2 decades in business and IT before academia. His research explores how cognitive biases shape trust in science and decision-making. Today, our topic is the human need for certainty, the ultimate challenge to science. Welcome, Dr. Kilianski. How are you today?
Thank you, Husna. I'm fine. Very honored to be invited to do this. I think it's
We're
an
honored
important
to have
topic,
you.
and I hope our viewers will get a lot out of this.
Hopefully.
So, yes, the human need for certainty, the ultimate challenge to science. With regard to the American public, I think it's probably fair to say that science and scientists are undergoing a crisis of distrust. Large swaths of the American public, according to public opinion polls, show that not only do they not trust scientists and scientific recommendations and suggestions with regard to health behaviors, particularly, but also that they think that the field of science is incompetent and corrupt. This, in my opinion, is a huge problem for society and for science. Now, there are numerous reasons for this. The history of science, there have been instances of fraud, cherry picking data, or worse, manipulating data so that researchers find the outcome they desire. These events are rare, they don't occur often, and when they do occur, because of the process of peer review and replication, they are usually discovered. Yes, it may take some time, but it's pretty unusual for those types of transgressions to go undetected. We have the mechanisms, we have the guardrails. It may take time, but they do get found out. Of course, there's also the money involved in research and the prestige and careers, and researchers, scientists have egos just like anybody else. So anytime there are huge chunks of money involved, whether it's grant money, whether it's from pharmaceutical companies or other private enterprises that often fund scientific research, though again, there are guardrails in place and people always have to practice full transparency for any financial support they get. The temptation, I guess, is there. And I think the public often sees that. The temptation is there, the possibility is there, and that raises suspicions. And of course, there have been ethical abuses. The Tuskegee Institute or syphilis study, where Black men had had syphilis were left untreated so that researchers could find out how the disease progressed. That was clearly an intolerable violation of any moral code. So all of those things, and then of course today we have the tsunami of misinformation that exists on the internet in all different forms and platforms, and proclamations that are made by people with little or no expertise, generalizations and bold claims without evidence. So all of these things play a role, but I think the biggest problem is something more fundamental, and it has to do with the way the human mind functions. And that is, human beings have an extraordinary drive to feel certainty about things, to be convinced that their beliefs are absolutely true with no doubt whatsoever. Now, what happens when people are confronted with information that's conflicting or ambiguous and they have to decide what to accept as true and what to reject as false? When this happens, people experience uncertainty, and a host of aversive cognitive processes and affect, right, emotions are elicited. Dissonance, mental conflict, friction between competing ideas or choices of action. These are unpleasant, and they often generate fear, they generate doubt, anxiety, apprehension, and distress. These are all states that human beings wish to avoid, and when they're experiencing them, they wish to eliminate. So people do have this drive for certainty. And when they are uncertain, they will make significant efforts to resolve the uncertainty.
One question I have
Yes.
might be a little off stray, but how do you think, like, do you think the need for certainty is universal across like all cultures? Do you think some societies handle certainty or uncertainty better than others? Like, what are the factors that help people basically um work around the fact that if they're uncertain about something or if they're certain
Well,
about it?
that's a fascinating observation. Some people tolerate uncertainty better than others. I am not aware of any of the research, cultural research on uncertainty, but obviously it's an individual difference variable. Some people tolerate it better than others. Some experience those negative affects and mental states that I talked about before. Probably people who tend to be higher in neuroticism, which is the sort of free floating anxiety that plagues many parts of their life. But I think that these reactions to uncertainty actually have an evolutionary origin because our hominid ancestors, long before there was anything like civilization, who existed in the wild in sort of an animal state, had to act quickly and decisively in order to avoid danger and secure opportunity for resources. Delay basically equated to disaster.
Mhm.
And uncertainty leads to doubt and it leads to delay. I'd like to take a little deviation from the path here and talk about a fictional character who embodies the angst and the distress of anxiety and how it leads to inaction. And that would be Shakespeare's Hamlet. So remember the soliloquy, to be or not to be. That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to take arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing end them, or to bear the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Right? This is a soliloquy about uncertainty. Hamlet is plagued by doubt and he doesn't know what to do. And this is an extremely distressful state for him. But at the end of the soliloquy, there's a fascinating conclusion, which is this. He comes to the conclusion that this anxiety, this doubt, leads to a state of behavioral paralysis. It leads to inaction. And
Yeah.
inaction for our ancestors, our hominid ancestors, was catastrophic. It cost them the opportunity to thrive, to survive, to reproduce, and pass their genes on to succeeding generations. So I think all human beings have this aversion to uncertainty that they seek to avoid or resolve with every effort at their disposal.
I guess that's why there's like a saying, just go with the flow. Like, if you're uncertain of something, yes, it's going to lead to inaction. And that actually causes more trouble in the future. You're losing time. So just go with the flow. Like, even when you're uncertain about something, just go for it. The worst case is you might fail, but what does failure lead to? Learning a lesson and seeing how you can, build up from there. Yeah.
Yeah, and that really leads me to a philosopher and psychologist from the late 19th century here in America, who is really renowned for his intellectual skills and insight about the human condition. And that, of course, was William James. So, what James said was that human beings are endowed with a will to believe. Now, he was talking about this in the context of religious belief, but it's more generalizable to all human knowledge and all human decision making. James said that we need to act, right? And what leads us to action? What leads us to action is certainty. So even when people have inadequate evidence or no evidence, forming a conviction, a sincere belief, being absolutely certain about something is critical to action. And that certainty that leads to action is beneficial in most cases for both the individual and for society, because without that, with uncertainty And doubt, there is no action. And that usually has adverse consequences for the individual and certainly for society as a whole.
I agree that I think that also applies with your studies. Like, if you believe that a certain study or something you're dedicating your time to is going to have a positive outcome in your life, that's a belief right there, right? And you're certain of it. There's an like it benefits you. On the other hand,
It
when you
does.
don't believe something, it definitely doesn't. You're not helping in society in any way either.
Yeah,
So.
some people may call it having the courage of your convictions. All right, so we need to talk about a counterpoint, though, to William James and his perspective here. What happened was about 100 years later, in fact, so they weren't contemporaries. William James was already deceased. Bertrand Russell, also a philosopher, talked about religious belief. Again, this was the context where they were having their pseudo debate, if you want to call it that. And Russell said he believed that people had or were endowed with the will to believe. And he said that it was necessary to take action and have your convictions of your action. But he said the problem with the will to believe is when we are wrong, when we seize upon a belief and we're certain it is true, the search for evidence ceases. We close the door. We no longer look for evidence, and we certainly don't look for evidence that would refute or undermine what we believe. Why? Because that leads to uncertainty, and uncertainty is unpleasant, and we have a powerful motive to avoid that. So Russell said the only way to discover if you're off the path of truth and on the path of error is the will to doubt. Mm-hmm. Constant questioning, constant re-examination, constant challenging of one's knowledge is essential to avoid error, to detect it, and to remain on the path to truth.
Mm-hmm. I have a question.
Yeah.
So I guess a little bit more like when you look at your life, it's always going to be a journey of just searching, right? This could be searching for meaning, searching of what you want to do with your life, or of the whole entire existence.
Sure.
But and you definitely need to believe on something to hold on to life. But at the same time, that doubt allows you to continue your research into whatever field you're doing. This can be being like a topic, like your science or research. This could be faith, anything. And how do you think, like, when do we know that, when can we be certain, like, how can we continue with uncertainty while being certain with certain things? Like, what I'm trying to ask is, how can we balance the both? So how can we balance both being having like the will to believe, but at the same time the will to doubt? How do we balance those two things?
Well, I would say there are probably three domains where the principles may vary. Of course, one domain is knowledge about nature, about sort of the objective world out there, right? The second domain is probably morals, human values. And then the third domain is the domain of the supernatural or the spiritual. And now science claims only one domain for its own, and that's knowledge about nature. Those other two domains, science has very little, probably mostly nothing to say. Mm-hmm. So, of course, what I'm focusing on here is the kind of knowledge that science is about. So this isn't about spiritual knowledge or supernatural knowledge, right? Supernatural above or beyond nature. And it isn't about moral truth or moral knowledge. Those are outside the ken of science. So, but that's where I'm going next, obviously, because that's what we're about here, the challenge to science. So, science embraces the ethos of uncertainty. In science, there is no such thing as absolute enduring truth. Every truth, every bit of knowledge we have about the natural world and how it works, why things are as they are, is conditional. It's based upon data and it's tentative, meaning that if the data change, and I'll talk about several reasons why that can happen, we'll be forced to revise our view of the truth. Now, something that we accepted as truth before may be completely overturned, or it may be only partially overturned. It may be a truth that holds only under certain conditions, limited conditions. But this is what the scientist does, constantly challenges what we already know. And if the data conflict with what we already know, assuming that the studies have been carried out properly and the measurements are accurate, et cetera, then we have no choice as scientists but to revise our view of the truth. This is a little bit difficult for most people to handle because people don't like uncertainty, and science is predicated on the assumption of uncertainty. All truths are tentative, all truths are conditional. So let me talk about a couple of, quote, scientific truths that people held to actually sometimes for entire millennia, but then they were overturned.
Oh, like this one.
So we can start with the classic textbook example, which is the idea of a geocentric universe. People have been carefully observing the heavens, recording data, making measurements over extended periods of time. And everyone who did this came to the conclusion that all the heavenly bodies, right, the sun, the moon, the other planets, the stars, the comets, all revolved around the Earth. Nobody disputed that. That was accepted as true knowledge until the 16th century when Nicholas Copernicus, who was also, had a lot of data, started to think about things in a slightly different way. So this was a theoretical advance, right? This was an insight. He realized that a better model to describe the universe was not that everything revolved around the Earth, but rather that everything revolved around the sun. It fit better with the data and with his observations and the observations of other astronomers. Now, there was a lot of resistance to that idea, needless to say, but astronomers started to realize and came around to the idea that he was true. So a truth about the way the universe ran was upended by one man's research and insight. And there are so many other examples of that in science. I mean, the history of science is replete with these things, right? At one time, it was believed by all scientists that fire was the result of the consumption of an unknown substance that existed within all flammable materials called phlogiston. There's no such thing as phlogiston. But it took Joseph Priestley's experiments to show that fire was actually rapid oxidation. It was not phlogiston. It was the oxygen that was in the air that resulted in the heat and the light that we call fire. Mm-hmm. Same thing was true of the so-called miasma theory of disease. Again, medical doctors, scientists who researched disease before we knew what it really was, thought all illnesses were caused by bad air. Bad air. But what is bad air? Air that makes people sick. It's a circular definition. Well, finally, it was discovered that it wasn't bad air. It was microorganisms that could be transmitted through the air, but also through other means that were actually the cause of disease. So we went from the miasma theory of disease, that it was caused by bad air, to the germ theory that it was caused by microorganisms. Again, the history of science, and you can even go to relatively contemporary things too. Like, Einstein said, God does not play dice with the universe. But quantum mechanics and the data that have been obtained by quantum theorists show that subatomic particles do behave not according to lawful things, but probability alone. chance, sorry, God does play dice with the universe, Albert. You're wrong. So, I mean, this is science. Everything is constantly challenged, everything is constantly changing. And this is how we arrive at a closer and closer approximation of the truth with respect to what's going on in nature.
And how do you think we can, like, scientists can get people to understand this aspect of science and accept it? Since we're
I'm going to
so,
get there. I'm going to get there with my recommendation at the conclusion of the talk, if that's okay.
yeah,
Because,
definitely.
because some people have had ideas, and I'll talk about one of them that was actually published in the op-ed in the New York Times a couple of months ago. But I'm going to have my alternative.
Mhm.
So, science is founded on the ethos of uncertainty, the will to doubt, as our friend Bertrand Russell, who's depicted there, said. Right? Knowledge is dynamic and subject to continuous update and change based on empirical evidence. And why does empirical evidence change? Sometimes there are theoretical insights, like Copernicus's insight, but sometimes it's technical advances. Right? The microscope allowed us to see microorganisms that are not visible to the human eye. Telescopes allowed us to get more accurate readings on what was going on in the planetary and extraplanetary objects in the sky. MRI machines, PET scans, have allowed us to explore the brain more deeply and see what's going on there. And we've drawn a lot of conclusions that are pretty counterintuitive and ran against what would be common scientific knowledge. And then, of course, we had the subatomic particle colliders, which allowed us to blow electrons and protons and neutrons up in these super colliders and see the results so that we knew what was going on at the quantum level. So some of it is technology. Often it's just theoretical insights by people who have worked on problems for an extended period of time and then have these brilliant flashes of the aha moment, as they might call it. And then they test it empirically with data. And if it continuously supports their insight, then we know they're onto something. Okay.
Yes.
So that's the nature of science, to embrace uncertainty, to embrace doubt. It's really what we need to do all the time if we're going to remain on the path to truth and avoid the path of error. All right, so this is a problem for laypersons, ordinary people who don't practice science. Why? Because the recommendations and suggestions that are made by entities like the National Institute of Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the FDA, the EPA, the kind of recommendations they make and the kind of advice that they dispense publicly changes. That annoys people, that unsettles people. They get suspicious because science tells them different things. Oh, they tell us this is bad for us this week. Then a month from now, they tell us it's good for us. And then 2 months from then, they tell us it's bad for us. Why should we listen to these people? They don't know what they're talking about. Yeah, well, that's how science goes, people. That you have to understand that, this progresses slowly.
And
Now,
what
one
can
other
people
thing I forgot to say, and this is really important too, especially when it comes to recommendations regarding medication, regarding all kinds of health-related behaviors, vaccines, is that when research is first published, they're usually working with samples over a short period of time. So the long-term effects, the long-term effectiveness, the long-term consequences or side effects are unknown. But these come to light after extended periods of time. But researchers want to get their results out there quickly. And I mean, if we think back, right, to Operation Warp Speed and the development of the vaccine for SARS-CoV-2, which most people know as COVID-19, was accomplished in a miraculously short period of time. But we had short-term data, the samples of people who they gave these vaccines to, right? were observed over a period of months, not a period of years or decades. So again, there's a lot of uncertainty in science. Scientists embrace it. The public does not.
And how can we help the public embrace this? Like, how can we help people, or how can scientists at least promote the idea of uncertainty to the public? So at least misconceptions that happen with all the research that happens, because obviously, as you said, there are changes that happen, right? And we do see it, like maybe even your relatives, like your grandparents, you can hear them say, well, they said this was good for me, and now the next week the doctor is saying this, and we see this a lot.
Right.
How can we help people accept this?
Well,
And how
again,
can
I'm going to leave that for the end of the talk,
okay.
where I suggest, and it's not a short-term solution, it's a long-term solution. But all right, so let me move on to the next slide, because here is another reason why, and this is a little bit more technical. And so some people are probably not considering this, but this is a secondary reason why the public loses confidence in science. And that's because in science, nothing is ever proved. Proof means you are 100% certain. It means once you have proof, it's impossible that you are wrong. So we have proof in mathematics, right?
We do.
All the three angles inside every triangle have to add up to 180 degrees. We've got the Pythagorean theorem. That's a mathematical law. You have proofs in logic, right? If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C. I mean, those are incontrovertible proofs, but you don't have proof in science. Now, people may say, well, how come? Well, the answer is because in most scientific endeavors, certainly when it comes to health-related recommendations and behaviors, and in a field like psychology or in botany or in biology or even in astronomy, we can never study entire populations. We only have the ability to study samples, which are subsets of populations. So astronomers can't study every star. They don't even know how many there are. They don't even know where most of them are, right? This whole thing about dark matter. Researchers who are interested in gender differences cannot study every man and every woman. Somebody who's interested in a treatment for an illness or a disorder cannot try the treatment on every person who has this illness or disorder. So we have to study samples, which are subsets of populations. And then we have to have a way to draw conclusions about populations from sample data. The thing is, and this is very difficult for people to wrap their minds around, that with sample data, any result can come about by chance. Yeah, let me use a concrete example of you got a vat of 20,000 M&Ms in front of you and you're blindfolded. You stick your hand in that vat of M&Ms, and let's say in your hand you can take out 30 M&Ms. Now you take your blindfold off and you look at your hand, and all the M&Ms are green. Can you conclude that all 20,000 of those M&Ms in that container are green?
So yeah, you can't.
No, you can't. You
can't.
can't. That could happen by chance.
Mm-hmm. And so with all these samples that are done though, at the end, there is at least some conclusion, right?
There is, but the thing is, it's a probabilistic conclusion.
Yeah.
Because what we're working with then is the probability or likelihood of getting this result by chance if there were no effect. So let me use a concrete example. Let's say I've developed a new medication for major depression, and I want to find out if it's effective. And I'll give you a really simple design. We're going to do an experiment. I'm going to get 2,000 people who have been diagnosed with major depression. And I'm going to ask my subjects if they want to participate. And all 2,000 people agree. They clearly all have major depression. They've been diagnosed by psychiatrists. But I tell them, listen, in this study, I have to see whether or not my medication works. So I need to compare it to something else. And the something else is going to be a placebo, which is an inert substance that has no psychoactive effect. It's a flour pill or a sugar pill. So you may get the placebo or you may get the active drug. Are you willing to participate? And everybody agrees. They have a 50-50 chance of getting the drug or getting the placebo. So what happens is I administer, technically, I wouldn't do it. I would have an assistant do it who doesn't know who's getting the placebo or the active drug. And then I follow these people, and after 2 months or 3 months, I get some index of the severity of their depressive symptoms. And lo and behold, I find out that the mean depressive symptomatology has gone way, way down in my sample, and it hasn't changed in my population. So the placebo had no effect. Actually, placebos usually do. But my drug has had what appears to be a huge effect. Can I conclude that I've proven that my drug works for the population? Now, the population is everybody who's currently suffering from depression, everybody who'll be diagnosed next week, everybody who'll be diagnosed next year. I do not know who those people are. I have no idea who they are, but I want to try to determine whether my drug is going to work for them.
So it's always like an experimentation. So let's say I
In
have
this case, yes.
yeah. So like that, I mean, I guess if you're someone who takes pills from like a doctor, then you're also a part of an experiment or research, I guess, because if those medical pills worked on a certain person, and let's say that now you're able to use them because of a certain data they've obviously like put out
Yeah.
there, and obviously it's not certain, there's always uncertainty.
Yes, because
It's
you're in
like
the
a
realm of
cycle of
probability. Now, when it
yeah.
comes to a drug study, if you want to have a pharmaceutical company take on developing and marketing your drug and testing your drug, you have to have, you're never going to have 100% certainty, but you got to have like 99.999% probability that your drug is actually effective. Now, of course, let me take a step back here. There is no treatment, drug or otherwise, that's going to be effective for 100% of the people who have the illness.
Mhm.
That just doesn't happen. That's unrealistic. So what you're usually looking at is some kind of a mean. You have a measure of depressive symptomatology, and the mean for the severity is much lower for the sample group who's received the drug than for the placebo group who hasn't. Or the percentage of people who have improved is much higher in the drug group than it is in the placebo group, right? And again, inferential statistics, and we don't need to walk into the weeds there, but tells you, it gives you an estimated probability of getting that result by chance. And if that probability is low enough, then you say, look, I have evidence that my treatment is probably effective. For everybody, probably not. But for most people, yes. And that's a good enough solution, especially if I've compared my drug to another drug that's out there, and my drug has shown to be probably more successful than that drug. Well, then it would make sense to develop and market that drug.
Mhm.
But it's always probability. And this is just so hard. Even the students in my statistics class have a hard time wrapping their minds around the fact that you haven't proven that it worked. No, I just have compelling evidence that it's worked. There's a high probability that it works, but we don't have certainty.
Yeah. And then that leads us to our conclusion, which is the uncertainty that humans want, that like every
Yes.
science in that aspect, where they're giving, well, results that are always going to be uncertain because it's not proved.
So let me talk first about, and one of the things that prompted my desire to do this talk was an article that I encountered, because I read the Sunday New York Times every weekend, especially the op-ed page, the opinion page. And an economist by the name of Emily Oster, this was back on November 17th, wrote an article about how the Centers for Disease Control, the FDA, the EPA, the National Institutes of Health had actually fostered this crisis of distrust in the public. And her claim was they did so because their proclamations, their recommendations, and their suggested courses of action were too certain. that they didn't talk about the limitations or the qualifications or the reservations that of the research. Now, look, as a scientist, you always do that. You do that when you submit your work to a journal, a peer-reviewed journal. You do that when you present your work at a conference to your colleagues. You always talk about the limitations and the possible flaws in your research, that you limit your generalizations. We're very circumspect as scientists, and we love the thoroughness and all the detail. The problem is all that does is induces uncertainty in the public. And I think the reason why these health-related institutions that, at least in the past, have been run by scientists and staffed by scientists have been unwilling to talk about all the reservations, to state all the qualifications and limitations and potential flaws of their study, because they know that the public will not react well to that and their message will fall flat if they do so. In business, we used to use, and it was a bit of a weird acronym, KISS, K-I-S-S. When you were dealing with a potential client or an existing client, keep it simple, stupid. Don't complicate things with all the qualifications and all the details, because you're not going to get the business, or if it's an existing client, they're going to have doubt, and now you may lose the business. So that's why I think that these institutions have not gone that far into the weeds, because all it does is it increases uncertainty. Now, okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna say though, I feel like they should, because I mean, in a simple manner, because like, I mean, I guess like what they do is, all the side effects are always written in the smallest text on a bottle. But I feel
They
like
are.
and people, like for me, for example, if I were to get medication for my eyes, I would want to know what the flaws of that, I guess like what I'm about to use, like what certain flaws it might have. I feel like that would at least allow me to be a
Yeah,
little bit
well,
more
they don't even get that.
confident in
They
myself.
are required by law to list any side effects that occur during their studies. Right. So you hear the TV commercials all the time for all sorts of medications. They
Like
will always
breastfeed.
a number of side effects. Sometimes it's death. Right?
Yeah, that's
I
true.
mean, but they have to, because some of the subjects in their study did die while on the medication. Now, may not have been because of the medication. It may have been something else, but they
Yeah.
have to provide that data, and they have to state those as potential side effects in their ads. But they'll never talk about the level of probability or the level of certainty. They'll never say that with a 99.9958% probability this will work for most people. You don't hear them say that. All right, so now here's my solution. I thought Emily Oster's recommendation would backfire. Maybe it'll work. I don't know. I think it has to do with science education. Now, of course, people have criticized the United States education system for a lot of its flaws and shortcomings. I don't want to do that. I think the education system does probably a pretty decent job of exposing kids to what we currently know about nature. Right? In other words, they're pretty good at teaching kids about scientific truth as it exists right now. What the most contemporary research shows us we should accept as knowledge. The thing that the American education system doesn't do very well, and may not do at all, is teach kids how we know this. The method, the underlying principles of science, things like I just talked about, the continuous updating and changing of knowledge, which requires doubt, it requires uncertainty, it requires peer review and replication. It requires assuming that what we knew before may not be true now when we have new advances on the horizon, technological advances that allow us to measure things more accurately and more precisely, larger sets of data that tell us how things occur over the course of time and may be more representative, that give us an accurate estimate of the population, and simple scientific insights, right? And I think, of course, look, this would start really young. Have kids do their own experiments in a classroom, right? I mean, you could start to do this with first and second graders. No, they wouldn't do the inferential statistics, but you could learn how researchers set up an experiment and how they test the results. And then when kids are old enough, and this would be, in my opinion, by third or fourth grade, they can begin to understand probability and they can begin to understand simple inferential statistical tests where
And that
you compare averages. Fourth graders can compute means, and where you can compare frequencies. Third and fourth graders are fine with frequencies and percentages. You can do this kind of thing, and then the public would realize how science actually works, how we determine what to accept as true and reject as false. And I think with better insight into how science works, not just what we currently know, because that's always going to change, but rather how we know it.
I agree. I definitely agree. I feel like if what you recommended is done, that would also foster a new generation that accepts the fact that science is never like
Yeah,
certain. They would accept that fact. And actually, I feel
knowledge
like
is not
that would help
static.
science so much more because there would be more people willing to, help that science or research. But yeah, they should definitely do that. I mean, I was a student who
Well,
just
that's not going to have any effect on how the general public reacts to science for a long, long time.
Well, yeah, it's a lot. It would have like what you recommended, people doing like schools applying that the education system, and it would have a long-term positive impact on science, but maybe not short-term, obviously.
Now, I would also say that chancellors of universities, I mean, there are very few required courses that all undergraduates have to take these days. I would say inferential statistics should be a required course for all undergrads. And I would probably include it in a high school curriculum as well.
Mhm.
Because let's face it, we are barraged with, quote, statistical evidence from politicians, from our doctors, from lawyers, from advertisers all the time. We have to be able to evaluate these things regarding whether or not we should follow those dictates. And if you know how the research works, you'll be able to detect the flaws in some of the evidence, so-called evidence that's being presented. Most of these, whether it's lawyers, whether it's advertisers, I'm not going to be cynical enough to say that they're always trying to mislead us. I think sometimes it's just ignorance that leads to a misuse of statistics and data. But we have to be able to detect that when it's happening.
I agree. That would make me feel comfortable too.
Yeah,
Learning. Well, thank you, Dr. Kilianski. This was honestly a really educational and amazing discussion presentation you had. We thank you so much for joining us. I want to ask you three of the e-talks questions before we end our live discussion.
certainly.
And they're more personal, but what would be three books you'd recommend to our audience? This could be related to the topic. It could be just for personal likes.
Well, a social psychologist by the name of Tom Gilovich
Mhm.
has written a book called How We Know What Isn't So. And it's subtitled The Fallibility of Human Reason in Everyday Life. The book is written for a lay audience. It's not, he's a social psychologist, but he doesn't get deep into the weeds in terms of research methods and everything. He describes some classic studies in social psychology of how people come to accept things as true when in fact they're not, and how once they do that, it's very difficult to change their minds.
Yeah, I
We think like lawyers and not like scientists. So once we believe something, if we even continue to search for evidence, we carry out an asymmetric search. We look for stuff that supports what we already believe, and we explain away or ignore information that contradicts what we believe. Why? Because that leads to uncertainty, and that's uncomfortable and distressing.
And this is so much more common in this country, I feel like, because everyone's a lot more individual. Like like people here are brought up more to be like as an individual rather than like working as a team. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like that's a big problem younger people face. with the older generation, but at the same
Yeah.
time, the older generation faces in accepting newer things. What would be
Okay.
our third book?
The second one, that was only one. The second one I'll put out there is Bertrand Russell's Will to Doubt.
Okay.
It's a very short book, but he makes such a compelling argument for the importance of transcending the will to believe and managing to find out when we are in error and how to correct error. It's just a great book on how to think.
And then the third book would be?
Boy, the third book, it's so hard because there are so many great ones out there. I would always encourage people to read one of these so-called great philosophers. Whether you want to do Aristotle, whether you want to do Plato, whether you want to do who's my other favorite? Immanuel Kant. It's a challenging read, believe me, because philosophers usually write in pretty complex sentences, and there's a lot of obscure terminology that they might use. But reading philosophy really teaches you to think and to process arguments at a really deep level. So yeah, I do encourage people to read philosophy. Tom Gilovich's book is great. And of course, what was the other one I suggested? Short-term memory is a little.
Pluto, and then there was one I didn't write. I couldn't get the name down. It was a lot of first and
Oh, The
last.
Will to Doubt, Bertrand Russell's Will to Doubt.
No, for philosophers.
Oh, well, I mentioned sort of the classics like,
yeah.
Plato's Dialogues and those sorts, and Aristotle. Can't go wrong there.
Well, for all the psychology students out there, now you know that you should definitely read more into philosophy if you aren't already. Might help you in your career path. And then The Will to Doubt if you're in science. That's how I'm subject opinion. And then what would be 3 movies you would recommend to our audience?
Oh, good Lord.
It could be one too if movies are
that's a hard one, and it's a hard one because my preference in movies is for really bad, campy, unintentionally funny horror movies. So,
okay.
or monster movies, which is absolutely terrible. The original Godzilla, and the original Godzilla movie was actually Japanese subtitles.
I never watched the original.
No, but it's actually Japanese, and a remake where they had it dubbed in English, and they included an American actor because the original one, all the actors were Japanese. The remake included Raymond Burr, who was a famous 1940s, 50s, and 60s American actor. He had a couple of TV shows. Perry Mason, where he serves as an attorney in court, is probably the most famous one, but he was also Ironsides. I think he was a chief of police of whatever in a metropolitan area. Those things are funny because, I mean, first of all, the premises are completely ridiculous. The monster is obviously a guy running around in a suit, and
okay, yeah.
And the dialogue is so stilted too. It's like, come on, you had screenwriters. These people were professionals. They didn't do a good job.
Yeah. I want to watch this just because of what you said. All right. And then what movie and what's your favorite color? Last one. Yeah.
My favorite what?
Your favorite color.
Well, I'm big on natural tones, browns and greens. That's usually what I wear. Black is the absence of color, so I can't count that. But yeah, I like the natural tones. I have hazel eyes, which are green/brownish. So those colors basically match my eyes, and my hair, which it's getting a little bit more gray these days, but it's still pretty brown.
I have a personal.
I think it goes, and then I think it goes reasonably well with my skin tone. I don't like red. Try to avoid wearing anything that's red. And where am I a professor at Rutgers? Everything is red at Rutgers.
Yeah, Yeah, my university too. And I have one question actually. It's a little bit
Yeah.
more personal, but a lot of our guest speakers, when they're from at least like the engineering or sometimes science field. I mean, your psychology science is still in it, but most of the time we've always had people who say their favorite color is blue. I'm just curious. This is like off topic, but and then you're saying green and like
Yeah.
brown, which is like new to my ears for the past. Thank God, because everyone's saying blue, and it's interesting because I'm like, oh, I wonder why all these people are so like, why blue is their favorite color. I don't understand. Is it related to how like the career they pursued? I don't know. Like, does the work you do affect your likes in certain
Yeah.
colors?
Well, blue is supposed to be a relatively calming color,
I
right? So
guess.
it doesn't energize or provoke. And I think greens and browns are too. Like yellows and reds are supposed to be provocative colors that energize you, right? They kind of lift you. You get a little
Exactly.
adrenaline rush with red and yellow and orange and bright colors like that. But
Mhm.
blues and I think even greens are supposed to be relatively calming.
Mhm. No,
Not like a neon green. That might be a little too much, but
this is interesting because like a lot of people say blue, which is the color of the sky, and then you're saying green, which is basically all around us, and plants, trees.
yeah,
That's funny.
the nature stuff, I guess, is part of it.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope all of
Okay,
our enjoyed it. Um, Thank you
it
again
was
for
fun,
this
and
episode.
I'm hoping that this crisis will somehow resolve itself because I
Hopefully.
am a big believer in science and I am a big believer in the health recommendations that are made by people who are professionals, who have the expertise, they have the experience, and they have the motive to tell the truth.
Mhm.
They are not obfuscating truth for their own benefit in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Well, thank you once again. And
Okay.
have a nice day, everyone. Thank you for
Okay,
joining
who's not very
this
nice meeting
episode.
you.
It was really nice meeting you too, and really nice hosting you here. Honestly, this was a very nice topic. I really enjoyed it. Um, Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.